Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patricia YouTube channel. Today I'm joined by both my co-hosts, Marcus and Mark, and we're going to carry on a little bit of our conversation from last time in episode one of what we called Staging Early Christianity. In that conversation, Marcus and I discussed the origins of the Gospels, and we got quite bogged down in that conversation in a quotation by Papias about Hebrew Matthew, a irregular Markan narrative, and perhaps also the Gospel of John. And so we didn't really get into some of the details of the sources for our four canonical Gospels and the origins of the texts. And one of the reasons that I'm glad we didn't is twofold. First one is because we allowed ourselves to have a discussion about Papias that meant that I learned something about the placement of Papias in Eusebius's book 3. And I highly recommend you go back and watch that to see that moment of revelation appear on my face as Marcus explained it. But also because Mark Bilby wasn't here with us, who is expert on some of the pre-canonical texts that may have influenced our canonical gospels, and indeed has even written a excellent book on the subject of the strata that may have played a part in influencing or provided a basis for the four texts we have. And so, with that bit of background about our last conversation, perhaps Mark, you could expand a little bit on your PhD thesis and what has been reworked into a book, and some of the conclusions that you found to do with the influences in the Gospels, but also this sort of pre-canonical material that you had uncovered.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. That's great. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there for the last conversation, and I think this is all very complicated material, and a lot of the traditional models for understanding it and mapping it are just woefully inadequate. People just kind of get locked into one way of interpreting the data, and the data is far more complex, and very little times, if ever, are statistically meaningful patterns surfaced as part of the analysis or made central to the analysis. So I think that's where the work that Marcus has been doing, we all have been doing on just statistical analysis of word morphological syntactical patterns and seeing divergences, splits, is really the key to unravel or unlock the earliest history of these texts, both sources and redactions. And so, and we've gone into detail in previous episodes about the Pauline material and how that probably went through at least 4 or 5 different stages: a 7 letter collection, a 3 letter collection, a 10 letter collection, a 13 letter collection, a 14 letter collection. You've talked about that with the Ignatian epistles. I think we have a similar kind of phenomenon. If I can share my screen, I've shared this before, but it's something that I think is just a useful visual for thinking about this. And of course, there are different ways of modeling, um, how the synoptic relationships are. But in my, view of scholarship, analysis of past scholarship, usually they look like pretty modest flow charts where there's this thing and it goes to that thing and maybe it goes into 2 directions, or it's just boxes and lines that are fairly simplistic. And I think the data is richer and more complicated. The lines often in those flowcharts help connect text to each other, but I don't think they model the data adequately, because I think what we see is if we just think like phenomenologically about this, what does the phenomenon look like of these texts in early Christianity? And what I see is this like snowballing effect or cascading effect or waterfall effect, where we just get expansion and expansion and expansion. And often the prior flowchart models, to a greater extent or a lesser extent, assume mutual independence, that canonical Luke was independent of canonical Matthew. And I think once you get into the fine-grained analysis of these texts, you see that there's cross-contamination happening all over the place. So any starting theory that there were 4 authors and they were mutually independent of each other, that should just be thrown out from the beginning, because there's just way too much cross contamination among these texts. But it's not just pure chaos, where we can't map the phenomena, we can't map the data. And that's where I think we just need to sort of take a step back and starting with Marcion's gospel as preserving our earliest data, our earliest like repository of data, our earliest data samples. Starting from there, how can we use that to sort of map the beginnings of this process? And that includes both its predecessor texts potentially, and then its subsequent texts. And what you can look at all kinds of things, but like the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain. If you compare Marcion's text to both canonical Matthew and canonical Luke, Marcion's text consistently evidences simpler, more primitive versions of those texts. And you can see both canonical Lucan tendencies to expand, you can see canonical Matthean tendencies to expand, and you can also see cross-contamination between those. And there are layers of conversation that simply aren't in Marcion's gospel.
Mark, can I shortly interrupt you? Because I think our viewers will be as confused as I am looking at these complex data. The complexity becomes clear, but the meaning of these complexities, I think, are important. Could you point out in your cascade here, in this marvelous tower, which of the data, maybe you can mark it with a color, which of the data you would equate with Marcion's New Testament?
Sure.
Because probably when you are saying that this is the start point for all the analysis that you have conducted, then I think it would be important either to have it on top, or at least, if not on top, then we mark it out so that our viewers and myself and Jack can see where we are.
Yeah, so I'll zoom in here. This was me starting from the conclusion that Badun and Klinghardt had come to before me about Marcion's gospel being a text written in the 80s. And
but that Klinghardt gives two scenarios in his revised version in the English publication by 2020. Okay. And that's quite interesting because he says, in principle, one could place it around the 80s, as you've got it. A second scenario would rather place it in the 130s, 40s.
Okay.
And weighing between the two, he has arguments for both sides, and doesn't make a decision, which is quite interesting.
Okay, between the 2015 where he committed to the 80s.
He started off where you are with the 80s, right. But then in the conversation that we had along the way, he was then seeing the arguments why it potentially would make sense, to place it in more proximity to the other texts.
Yeah.
And because when you talk about cross-contamination, it's very difficult to understand the cross-contamination across decades and around the Mediterranean. Because cross-contamination doesn't mean that the one just takes from the other. So let's say I take now your text, across the ocean. Mm-hmm. But cross-contamination would mean that there is mutual borrowing. So you take from me, I take from you. Well, on Zoom or on electronic media, that's potentially easier. Mm-hmm. But in the Mediterranean times of the 1st and 2nd centuries, people had to sit in proximity to each other to allow for cross-contamination. They must have met on the street. They must have met in a pub. I don't know. They must have had students who shared the classrooms and took material from A to B and from B to A. Otherwise, a cross-contamination is impossible, which also then, I mean, that's one of the major reasons why Matthias Klinghardt considers it. Given the fact that our synoptic texts, and that's what we're talking about here, including John, are literally related, not just by oral visions, but have texts in common, and do alterations to texts. it's only possible, historically only possible, I think, yeah, if you shrink time and space.
Okay. Yeah, I think that those are, I think in my findings that we should definitely be open to that. And this whole cascade could be moved several decades later and probably still work as a
Yeah,
model, as an overall
exactly.
model for the phenomena. But I also think it's important to, once we've isolated strata, to try to situate those historically as much as possible, and
Yeah,
to see when I look at the strata, I see cross-generational concerns, the same way we see evolutions between the Ignatian letters, where there's some basic knowledge of Paul and very little knowledge of any other scriptures, and then in the second go around we see this really robust knowledge. That looks to me like a very different setting, and
I totally agree. I totally agree. I
so
mean,
and
that confirms, or that's being confirmed by my own reading and by my own cascading of these things.
right. So I see as something similar where the early traditions, for instance, of Jesus's teachings, they're set within a Palestinian, largely Galilean context. There's very little concern about Jerusalem. There's no clear indication of Jerusalem's destruction in Marcion's text, for instance. So that to me should be taken seriously. And then I think a lot of it has to do with where we start as our most solid anchor points in history for mapping these texts. And obviously Josephus's Antiquities are very complex and contested text, and how we interpret those few passages that might speak to some of these things. And then how we interpret Pliny the Younger as well, which even his correspondence with Trajan, as you brought up before, has been challenged as being authentic or not. Those tend to be the places where I try to anchor these texts of trying to ascertain what is pre-Antiquities and pre-Pliny and what is post-Antiquities and post-Pliny, rather than starting from Marcion himself and his biography. And so I have just far more doubts about our ability to understand Marcion's biography based on the Polemicis. And so I feel like that's a shakier starting place, not to doubt his historical existence or anything like that, just to try to map these early textual histories. I think we're safer starting with Josephus's Antiquities and Pliny than trying to reconstruct a biography of Marcion. But we're getting too much into the
Honestly,
weeds.
I doubt both.
Okay. I see.
I mean,
right.
there's
Yeah.
there's no certainty on Pliny. There's less certainty on Josephus. And
Right. Well, there's certainty in terms of the influence that canonical Luke depends on Josephus in a lot of different ways, and
yeah,
Acts is dependent on Josephus in a lot of ways. I think that's not that
I would agree. Yeah.
Josephus clearly gives an attestation to the historical Jesus or the historical James. I think that's all well within our ability to question and have serious doubts about. But it kind of like this cascade, that Josephus's Antiquities was a substantive text written with its own concerns, voice, just very granular detail, and that canonical Luke and canonical Acts use it, but then also botch it. That's a very common thing within the canonical text, is to try to act historical, but actually get the historical details all wrong in all kinds of ways. So I honestly think this is another one of those strata splitting tools, is the more it tries to act like it has an intricate knowledge of geography or history or Aramaic or anything like that, those all push toward a later, date for when you have this simpler traditions that are not trying to come off as historiography.
That's why I would highly doubt Acts in Hadrian's times. Yeah.
Oh, so you put Acts after Hadrian rather than during Hadrian?
Definitely. Look, I mean, the first to ever read Acts and to give us a single line of Acts is Dionysius of Corinth, and he is a contemporary of Irenaeus.
Right.
So here in 170, we have the first reader that we know of.
Yeah.
And we have studies. I mean, people have looked into the reception history of Acts, and they come up all with the same result. There's nothing before Dionysius and Irenaeus who ever refer to Acts.
Yeah.
And
I wonder if go ahead, Jack. Sorry.
I was going to say, if I might reflect on that for a moment, We had someone in the comments, and I think also another scholar who questioned my position on the Pauline epistles and also the Gospels using reception. And they said to me, well, there's no reason that we might expect to see Paul quoted so early on. We have other examples where Greek writers aren't mentioned for another 100 years. Look, there's two things to say to that. The first is that, okay, it is not an argument on its own for reception. That's absolutely true. But there are other things that go into it, like we've talked about the Marcionite Apostolos in the case of Paul, for example, and other things that need to be evaluated. But the second thing about the reception business is this. If Paul is authoritative and the Gospels are important and significant, as we're led to believe Irenaeus says they are, then actually at least some expectation, we could have some expectation that they may be referenced, or a theology or a thought, or even, dare I say, an echo, to use traditional New Testament words. And yet we don't find these things popping up. In fact, in some cases, we get things that are counter Paul, that disagree in some sense with Pauline theology in early Christian texts, who supposedly would have known Pauline epistles. And indeed, even those apostolic fathers who supposedly knew the Gospels, again, it's actually not that clear that they do, and sometimes present a different reading. And so I just want to bring that to the forefront, that these quotations, echoes, allusions, whatever you want to call them, is actually a really substantial part of how we date stuff, and the reception of them matters just as much as any of the other arguments we use.
Yeah.
And if I may, Mark, one of the things that, going back to this cascade, that I want...
let me just add to your argument that you just voiced. I think there's the flip side to this argument too, because we can see, once we have, and Mark, that would play for the biography stuff, right? Once, let's just assume the heresiologists were right in placing Marcion after the Second Jewish War. If that were right, then it would appear to be a straight relation. If these texts, like the Gospel and Paul's letters, appear, let's say, around 138 or 40, as the heresiologists tell us. So it is interesting that precisely at these times, these texts are reflected in other people we can date, like Justin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just to say, we haven't got anything for 100 years. That's argumentum e silentio. But the corroboration of that is that once we're told that these texts appear on the scene after the Second Jewish War, in fact, we have a reception. And it is interesting to see when you look at the Oxford people in the 1910s and more recent stuff, or even in 1942, where we have this excellent study, the PhD on the reception of Paul in the Church Fathers of the second century. When you see all that material, you can really see that from the middle of the second century, Pauline letters have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a cascading or believing in either Pliny or Josephus or whoever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it is a corroboration of 10, 15 texts from the second century that we have. Some of them which we can date pretty well. I mean,
right.
The Apologists we can date pretty well. There might be a difficulty whether Aristides was meant for Hadrian or for Antoninus Pius, who also has the name Hadrian because he was an adopted son. But that's a difference of 10 years, yeah? But it's not a difference of a century.
Sure. Yeah.
If I might go back to the cascade, one of the things that our viewers might be seeing on this wonderful diagram is the letter Q, and followed immediately by an N. And I'm sure whenever people see Q, they think Dr. Streeter or now Kloppenborg. Could you just clarify for us what you mean by Q and what that text might be? Because one of the things that we discuss quite a lot behind the scenes is nomenclature, how we term and describe these texts. And I get very frustrated over nomenclature, because I think it's a nightmare to try and properly, give quick, nice annotations for these very complex things. And so perhaps you could just tell us a little bit, just so we understand the cascade a bit more, what QN means in
Sure.
this diagram.
I think in scholarship, Q has in fact served as a placeholder. Not everybody means the same thing by Q. There's talk of a consensus, but even among the so-called Q scholars, not everybody agrees on the exact content. Although there was the I don't know if facade is too strong of a word, but there was the appearance of critical edition, in the Hermeneia and Fortress series, where there was agreement with Robinson and Kloppenberg and so on. So it felt like something like a consensus, although lots of fuzziness and symbols and different ways of representing text to try to surface the disagreements there. But a lot of Q scholars disagree about whether this or that verse, this or that passage is actually in there. The traditional idea of it is that it is primarily a saying source, but that doesn't always hold true or prove consistent. The story of the centurion is usually placed in Q, even though it doesn't fit as a sayings text. It's a miracle story and dialogue, and there are other ones like that. In recent years, in the last 5 to 10 years, even among the Q school, there have been scholars who have pushed forward a narrative approach to Q. Daniel Smith is one of these, but there are others as well who have said that there's a narrative shape or arc. This probably goes back even farther than the last 10 years, but I think it's become more popular in the last 10 years of scholarship. So for me, Q was a known yet flexible placeholder, and with some subjectivity in that. And so I wanted to use that as well, but use it QN as a way of saying this is very similar to what we think of as Q. It overlaps a lot with what we think of as Q, but it's also significantly different. And it leans in the same direction as traditional Q scholarship, which is to prioritize the canonical Lucan material over the canonical Matthean material, both for order and for content. But when you look at Marcion's text and take it seriously as prior to canonical Luke, there are many texts and traditions that were doubted because they weren't so-called double traditions, like the woe statements. But there are many others as you go through the text where Q scholars doubted whether that was in there or not. But it's very, very clearly, often very almost word for word attested. It's kind of interesting as Tertullian, for instance, works through Marcion's gospel. The Sermon on the Plain material is just very carefully and thoroughly attested. It's some of our best attested material. But that also is striking to me, that it has this like power and clarity and resonance within the tradition. So, but when I looked more carefully at this, what I saw, and this was borrowing from the scholarship of other people. Several scholars have noted the Aesopian references in canonical Luke, but that included the Nazareth pericope and the end, Luke 24:25, as well as in Luke 7. There are many different, and a whole dissertation, and then Brill monograph has been written on this as well. And the scholar's name escapes me at this particular moment, but about all the Aesopian references. So when I started looking at Marcion's gospel, I saw this Aesopian reference, like very clearly right at the beginning, about physician, heal yourself. Aesopian quote. The very end about you fools, who are hard of heart, this kind of thing, slow to understand. That's like, I can't think of the Greek word right now. It's like braburoi or something like that. But there's an Aesopian reference at the beginning, and there's an Aesopian reference right at the end. It starts with an Aesopian, nice little pithy saying, and it ends with an Aesopian pithy saying. And then as you look through it, you find these other Aesopian references throughout the text, and even the idea of Jesus being thrown off a cliff. That's an Aesopian reference. A former colleague of mine, Tom Phillips, and Maggie Froelich had written an article about that, noting the connections between the life of Aesop, where he gets thrown off a cliff. So opening of Marcion's gospel is a very clear Aesopian reference, allusions. The end of it does. And then throughout, Jesus also looks very much like an Aesopian character. He's telling stories, he's telling fables. Some of them involve animals. But he's a bit of a jokester. He's known as a drunk and a glutton, apparently. From what we can tell in the text. All these other things. So I see. I could call, instead of calling Q, we could call it the Gospel of Aesop, or maybe better, call it the Gospel of the Poor, because while Jesus does say, "Physician, heal yourself," at the beginning there, that's Jesus's first words. It's very brief there, and what I see as the source. Now there is the Capernaum story, but I'm trying not to get too into the weeds at this particular moment. But the first speech that Jesus gives, substantive, dialogue, or you might say sermon, but succession of sayings, starts with "Blessed are the poor," makarioi tochoi, and the theme of the poor, or the beggars, right? It's a better translation probably. Tochas doesn't simply mean poor. There are other words in Greek for that, but it means those who beg, like a mendicant, we might say. So the opening of this speech that Jesus gives is focused on the beggars, and he seems to be giving good news to people who are poor and beggars, and who are powerless and oppressed and enslaved, and bringing woe on the wealthy and the powerful and the filled, and so on. So it's a very powerful and stark, I would say, sort of prophetic and yet also fabulist kind of character who emerges in this text. And that so much of that overlaps with traditional notions of Q. What differs is that there's a death and there's a resurrection. So this would be a very stark difference from traditional notions of Q. So instead of saying that Q and the Gospel of Thomas are these like twin texts that only have Jesus as a sage who gives sayings, this would put these early texts, place the sayings within a broader narrative context, not a full-orbed biography, but a life story that's more similar to the life of Aesop than it is to, the life of Alexander at this point, or stories of, other famous Roman emperors. But I'll stop there. I've spoken for quite a while, so let me turn it over to
That's
you
great.
guys. Yeah.
I just think what is important to say is, and that's an admission which you said in the beginning, when we start from Marcion's Gospel, whenever we place that in time, it is already a complex task, as we can see from the various attempts to reconstruct the text. Although, with all the differences of reconstructions, we also have to admit, and I think that varies sometimes people, if we only talk about the diversities of these reconstructions, that there is a core in all these reconstructions where, in many, many ways, these reconstructions are coherent and overlap. But we have to admit that when we start already from a reconstructed basis, and there is no other way to start from, because that's the first text that we have corroboration from outside. So it's a text which is witnessed for. So when we detect in this text underlying sources which we are retracing, we move from let's say, from an insecure basis, because it's based on reconstructions, we jump, I'd say, into in a different universe of insecurities. That I think we have to admit. We can trace elements, and we can see, and quite often you talk about the voices, or whatever you call it, these indications of where we have to go to find these earlier sources. Yeah, but the kind of hypothetical basis, or not basis, the hypothetical illusions that we are going to is enormous.
I would say yes and no. So I would, I think the whole approach and the cascading model condenses that into a simple visual. I think stage by stage analysis of any text. For instance, John's Gospel. How many stages did that go through? Was it 2? Was it 3? I think in our group we would be on the same page. At least it went through multiple editions. There wasn't just one go at creating the Gospel of John. It probably had multiple versions. What were those? Do we see distinctive traits or elements? So I tend to follow both MacDonald and von Walde there in saying that the initial stratum in John's gospel is a very Dionysian gospel. And then the next layer is much more of a Socratic overwrite, where Jesus becomes much more of a philosophical figure. And I think we see a very similar trajectory in the Pauline materials, where Paul isn't really, he's something of a philosopher, I suppose, in the Marcionite collection, but he becomes far more of a Stoic philosopher in the canonical collection. So there are these rewritings that have clear tendencies where, and it all makes sense too. Dionysus as a model for a new cult that's emerging out of the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, that fits all kinds of other trajectories and tendencies that we see around the Greco-Roman world, including, lionizing Roman emperors and Greek rulers as new Dionysus themselves. Richard Miller's scholarship brings that up, and many others, Courtney Friesen. But so that I think it's important to start with the premise that all of these texts are evolving. So then while that feels like speculation, I think that's the ground that we should be standing on. It's an evolutionary starting point. And then the challenge is, okay, how do we isolate strata? How do we model evolution? How do we model data flow? And that's partly why I brought up this. This is a story of Jairus's daughter that I'm looking at right now. And this is just the Greek. I haven't translated this portion into English, but this is one of the phenomenological mappings that I used to build that cascade. So it wasn't just starting from.
Could you give it a bit bigger?
Sure. It's a large passage.
Yeah, no, just that we are capable of reading the text themselves, and then you can explain what LK1 is, LK1, MT1, and LK2, and MK3.
Yeah. So on the left, we see nothing in this case because the story of Jairus's daughter is not there in Marcion's text, which again points to me that this was an earlier text. It didn't have the same level of intensity and miracle stories. It didn't have these very elaborately narrated miracle stories with families and homes and architectural details and all these kinds of things. But in this particular text, just phenomenologically, and this is where I use again a signals tracing approach, right? Where do we find direct signals? Where do we find bypass signals where it seems to be in one text and then skips over a text and goes to the third text? And then where do we find synthesized signals where it looks like two prior texts were combined together to make something new? And in this text, again, this is Greek, so maybe not all of our hearers can see this, but you can go read, a synopsis for this passage and see this. The trouble is the synopses start with traditional understandings of, Matthew, or placements of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and don't vary at page by page. So in my book, what I tried to do is move the columns around wherever I think the data actually sat in history. And so in this case, this doesn't fit Farrer Goulder. This doesn't fit traditional Q school, two source or two document hypothesis. This might be considered a weird one that fits other schools that aren't as common or other models. In this one, it looks like Gospel of Matthew has the earliest tradition. I guess there's some people that say, Matthean priority for everything, but it just doesn't make sense. But in this one, for this particular portion of the story, it does make a lot of sense, because in the Matthean text, there's just a very simple narrative about Jesus going into the house of a ruler. There's mourning, and then the ruler kicks out the crowd out of his house. Like there's a mourning crowd in the house. He kicks him out. Jesus comes in and does the miracle. It's very quick. It's clean. And when comparing this text to canonical Luke and canonical Matthew, it doesn't read well as an abridgment. It's a very distinct story. It's just the framing of it is very different. It's coherent yet simple. In canonical Luke, though, it's expanded out. We suddenly have the three, great disciples of Jesus, Peter, John, and James. We have additional family members, the father, a mother, and then we have more elaborate language about the miracle, and then more detail about the house and how there's kind of a group of people who are allowed to be the privileged witnesses of the miracle. And then in canonical Mark, it's even more elaborate. So Now Jesus starts like speaking Aramaic, almost in a magical sense, right? With Talitha Kum. There's even more people, but now we get extra architectural details. Where in the house, there's actually multiple rooms, and it's within an inner room that the miracle happens. So if you're just like to model this, like draw a house, or like draw, like have kids draw a picture of each one of these stories. And one, there's a crowd, there's a morning crowd at the house, they get booted out, Jesus comes in, miracle. Second one, there's a house, and Jesus goes in, and there's a crowd of people around to understand and see the miracle. And then the third one, there's a house with many rooms in it, and there's an inner room, and in this inner room, only a privileged few are allowed to go. And then when you look at canonical Mark, it picks up very distinctive language in canonical Matthew, like the Korasion, the little girl. That's not in canonical Luke in this place. It is in other places in canonical Luke, but not here. But then it picks up language that's only in canonical Luke, like rise or the father and the mother, right? So when you try to map this particular text, and so this would be like one of hundreds of examples I would point out to say, like, if people just started not from the assumption of there's a Matthew, there's a Mark, there's a Luke, we have to model, we have to like tie these to authorship, like just model this data. What makes sense as the data flow within this text? And it sure looks like it's going from Matthew to Luke to Mark. It's expanding, it's evolving, and Mark represents a synthesis of Luke and Matthew. So in this case, we have Markan anteriority. This would be a case where Mark seems to be the last tradition. It's far more elaborate, far more involved. And then if you try to map that onto Christian history, it maps quite well onto the rise of the house church, the Domus Ecclesiae. So I bring that out in the footnotes. Like, this probably represents a time when Christians' self-organization is far more complex, where they're actually like running an ecclesiastical organization out of a large house, and when there are patrons of a household who are housing this new religious movement. It's not a movement on the streets. It's not a movement of the synagogues. It's now a movement of the house. There's now house churches, right? So when we try to map that onto archaeological history and other analyses of just social history, that becomes interesting to me. So it's by starting with this, honestly, like I didn't start with the cascade and then try to fit everything in. I started by looking at hundreds of these examples and say, like, okay, where's the data going? Where, in which direction is the data flowing? And then once you map all these distinctive data flows, then like, how do you put that all together? And it looks like a cascade. It looks like a waterfall, right? Whether that's compressed into 10 years or whether that happens over 50 or 60 years, that I think that's up for grabs. But I see such involved rewritings that are distinctive that to me, it lends toward a greater time span, and also distinctive vocabularies where I clearly people can live in Rome and have distinctive cultural backgrounds and idioms that would account for differences. But like the difference between the Dionysian Jesus of the early form of John and the Socratic Jesus, those are pretty distinctive terms. So I don't see that happening in the same person, by the same person, and probably not even in the same generation. I see intergenerational rewritings happening across these texts.
But what I would like to do at some point, I mean, because we haven't done it yet on let's say on this story of Jairus' daughter, is exactly the same kind of semantic and lexical study that we have done extensively through all of the 10 letters of Paul.
Yeah, I have done that, and when I saw the distinctive Lucan terms like parachrema immedially. That's only in the canonical Lucan text. It's not in Matthew's text.
So that's something which I would like to see, and also just to look through the commentary of Klinghardt on that passage, which he includes, but also in a distinctively different format, because he points out there is an agglomeration of minor agreements, particularly in this passage.
Yeah, he mentions connections between Mark.
Explained.
Yeah,
we have Western
plural
readings. We have a number of Western readings, more than in the passage before and after. So that's something one would probably also need to look at.
Yeah.
And then the vocabulary, I think.
I agree, and I did that analysis, but I did that 4 years ago, and this was prior to us collaborating in a serious way. So I think going back through all of that carefully would be very helpful. But I did notice a lot of distinctive canonical Lucan features in
And especially,
vocabulary.
I think, since we've discovered that the Marcionite lexicography is not just a lexicography within the Marcionite gospel, but ranges across into the Pauline epistles. So that's quite a bigger chunk of lexicography that we have.
Yeah.
When we now compare these texts.
Right.
Which
Yeah,
I think gives us a better grounding for a judgment. For
it could well
example,
be.
to me it was quite clear. Matthias includes the Lazarus story because we know the Lazarus story was present. But the Lazarus story, as he reconstructed it, is basically reconstructed on the basis of Adamantius.
Yeah.
And Adamantius is quite clear. He makes use in this passage of the canonical text, not of the pre-canonical one. And whenever I found canonical material in Paul, it was never ever attested in any other text of the Marcionite Gospel, but then it was in Luke 16 in the Lazarus story. So that showed that the Lazarus story, as we have it attested in Adamantius at least, right, is canonical. The very few texts and verses, very, very few, of that story, which are being represented and witnessed by Tertullian and Epiphanius, are markedly Marcionite in the lexicography. That's quite the interesting thing. Yeah. So you have a difference in the same story from the people who attest to them. Now, here in the Jairus, none of them, not a single verse is attested. So we have a very similar case as we have with the epistle to Philemon, where we know the text could have been there because both Tertullian and Epiphanius tell us that this letter was within the collection, but we have no verse attested.
Yeah, there is. Marcion does attest to the flow of blood being, well, yeah, we should be careful. Like the issue of blood being healed, that is there. Yeah. It's just in canonical Matthew, canonical Luke, canonical Mark. We have a doublet story, but there's no doublet story attested. There's no, it's the little girl's introduced, then the old woman, then the little girl, right? It goes in that order in the three canonical texts. In the Marcionite text, there's only reference to the old woman with the hemorrhage who is healed. And it's very clearly attested by Tertullian and by Epiphanius.
Yeah,
so
that one is
I see the core of the story, but then this doubling happens, and I see that doubling entering in the Matthean, that first Matthean stratum, and then it gets expanded out quite a bit in the canonical Lucan stratum, and then it gets expanded out even more.
And now we shouldn't forget duplication is the feature, one of the features of the canonical redaction. They love duplications. I mean, anything you can duplicate, they do it. If you can say it twice, you say it twice.
It's a great way to insert new material. You state what was just stated, and then you put your own ideas in there, and then it sounds like, exactly. It's kind of like making a graft in a tree or something like that, or stitching together two things.
It's crazy, but it's one of the features.
Yeah. I think that was really helpful. Just have a slightly closer view there on that story of Jairus. So I was fascinated just listening to you both talk about it. But if I might, we won't go on too much longer, but I just want to draw you back out to the wider picture for a moment, because I think some of the viewers will also be surprised at some of the dates that you had in that cascade, particularly the one for QN. We've talked a lot on this channel about the origins of the canonical Gospels and then post-dating what we call aptly the pre-canonical in terms of Marcion. But what period do you think that we're dealing with for the earliest strata, the earliest traditions, in whatever form it might be? I don't care whether it's a saying, I don't care whether it's one sentence of something that might have happened, because we mostly talk about second century on this podcast. We love second century, but you had QN not in the 2nd century.
Right. Yeah.
So where do you get that idea from, and how do you put QN so early in when most people would put almost the entirety, like Jonathan Bernier, the entirety of the Gospel of Mark? How do you get
Right.
back to QN in that space and time?
Yeah. Well, it was starting from the 80s, and again, like because that was the view of Badun and Klinghart, who had looked closely at this. I understand that those are evolving. Klinghart's position has changed in various ways through the years about these texts. He used to subscribe to a two-source understanding of Marcion's gospel, and then he changed to it being the Ur gospel for everything. So his view has changed over the years, apparently on dating as well. But I was starting from the 80s, is what other scholars who had looked at this text carefully. I had also been influenced by Joseph Tyson, who tended to locate Marcion a little earlier in terms of the composition of canonical Luke. He puts Marcion more being active literarily in the 110s and 120s. So I've been open to that and influenced by Tyson's views on that in that regard. But it was also because I just worked closely on Pliny the Younger and his correspondence, and saw very clear appropriations of Pliny's letters in canonical Acts, and then also a little bit in canonical Luke. Even I also see Suetonius and Tacitus being influences on canonical Luke and canonical Acts, and then the Antiquities. And Richard Purvo had written before an article comparing. This was in a book. Badun's one of the contributors to it, but there's several. I think it was Early Christianity was the journal that they were working in. But Purvo had looked at canonical Luke and Marcion's Gospel and looked for Josephine Antiquities references, and he didn't find any Antiquities references in Marcion's Gospel, at least based on the prior reconstructions, but did find very clear, easily documented references to Josephus there. So when he was working on his commentary on Acts for the Hermeneia series. So there's been prior scholarship here that certainly has influenced my views, but it also just comes from once we isolate these texts. To me, one of the most important pieces there, I think it's Luke 21 or 22, where you have armies surrounding Jerusalem. So how do you read that particular text? Is that a 60s, late 60s Jewish war reference, or is it a Hadrianic reference of armies surrounding Jerusalem? Other traditions I think are salient here as well. So Jesus in canonical Luke, I think there are lots of Hadrianic references. Like Hadrian had dropsy. There's a very fascinating story about a healing of a man with dropsy that's only in canonical Luke. That might tie into Hadrian, who had a very famous case of dropsy. The triumphal procession, that sounds a lot like a Roman emperor like Hadrian on his Eastern campaign coming into the city of Jerusalem. And so I see a lot of Hadrianic allusions in canonical Luke, and I've documented those in my footnotes and proposed them. But I don't see those a lot of those Hadrianic references aren't in Marcion's text as I read it. So so I tend to read that armies surrounding Jerusalem, the stratopedon around Jerusalem, as sort of a Jewish war context statement, and it comes up right toward the end. So there's a little bit of an apocalyptic feel there in Marcion's text. It's primarily a saying source, but it feels to me like a revolutionary, almost like a slave revolt text. And Romans were famous enslavers of Jews and other conquests. So I see this as the Aesopian caricature or characterization of Jesus as who's a slave, right? The most famous, perhaps, slave in antiquity, in Greek antiquity, to picture Jesus as a slave and giving this revolutionary message about social upheaval, and quoting the prophets for that, and becoming a prophetic figure. To me, that fits a Jewish war context. That fits a 66 through 70 context. And then I see in this other third of Marcion's Gospel a backlash against that, where the Jewish wars happened, the temple has fallen, Rome is conquered, but there's also upheaval in Rome. I see early Mark as reflecting that as well, right? There's Year of the Four Emperors, like there's upheaval happening in the Roman Senate in 69 and 70. Mark feels to me like a deeply anti-Roman text where they've just been stung by having their temple destroyed, and Jesus is this embattled figure, but only surrounded by men. So it's interesting to me, the Marcion's text, Most of it centers Jesus as being anointed by a woman, which sounds like a kingmaker to me, being surrounded by an entourage of women, which sounds like it has royal connotations to me. So I see a real person and a real movement that sounds like it has a dynastic, but also slave revolt character to it. And then a backlash against that in the early version of Mark, where Rome is legion, right? You have these like embattlement stories and miracle stories where Jesus is constantly battling people in synagogues and encountering demons. And Rome represents the demons in this case, and foreigners, foreign gods who are coming in and invading the land, and Jesus is doing battle with them and conquering them. And yet it's not a traditional conquering. So I think it's a rewrite of it's sort of a mythological where Jesus becomes like a mythological conqueror, right? So if in Q Jesus is just an Aesopian figure who tells stories, offends people, and gets killed, there's this other portion of Marcion's gospel where Jesus becomes this embattled figure who's constantly getting into conflicts with Rome and its Rome sympathizers. And again, like then you have canonical Luke. So the way I see this is that there was an authentic movement that was prior to Hadrian, prior to Bar Kokhba. But then once you get Bar Kokhba and you get Hadrian, you get massive rewritings of these texts that happen where Jesus becomes an alternative to Bar Kokhba. Instead of Bar Kokhba being the new Messiah, you have Bar Kokhba as the antithesis. The Simon is the antithesis of Simon, right? You have a sort of a parting of the ways between a Bar Kokhba based messianism and then the Jesus messianism, which is rewritten to be overtly pacifist and subjugated to Rome. So I see the early text as not at all subjugated to Rome. It's very embattled with Rome or just resisting in terms of slave revolt, where the later rewrites tend to align these figures, Jesus and Paul, so that they're subordinationist. They're very Roman. They respect the traditional Roman order of family and piety and hierarchy. So you have an upheaval of hierarchy in the early traditions, and you have a complacency and conformity with the Roman hierarchy in the later traditions. That's how I put it together. I hope that makes some sense. I understand it's not totally persuasive, but that's kind of how I map, these moments. And I admit too, I don't think we can be absolutely precise yet. So these are hypotheses, and they need to be proved, and the model needs to be adjusted whenever the data merits it needs to be adjusted. But I think most of the models we just need to throw out. The traditional Q model, we need to get rid of it. Traditional FAR, it's garbage. It's right 20% of the time, 80% of the time, it's horribly wrong. So it should stop being taught in schools. The traditional Q school needs to stop being taught. Teach it in the sense of it's a model, but just admit it's completely failed. FAR Gulder completely failed. We need to throw all those models out, and we need to start just by doing data analysis and being open to a data flow mapping process with these texts, starting with Marcion's text and splitting Marcion's text and the canonical text as that split. That's like the wedge that we can use to start to get a clear view of what's going on historically.
That's one of the reasons why I had given up dating earlier strata, and just which is a minimalistic approach, but on the other side, it's a more cautious approach to start from, let's say, from a model which takes these texts as attested when A, they are being used, and B, when people say that these texts were written, not people today, but people in the 2nd century and early 3rd century are saying when these texts were written. And given the fact, for example, that Clement of Alexandria, when talking about the moves of these teachers into Rome after the Second Jewish War, why would he say so? It would be far more convenient for him to have said, oh, well, no, they were all contemporaries of Paul, right? And they were using his letters because they used them. Clement used them and others used them. But he doesn't say so. He says so quite clearly that these people were moved into exile after the Second Jewish War because of all the upheavals. And because Christians, of course, had a different an easier way into Roman society in those years after the Second Jewish War than the Jews had, which is quite true for the first 20, 30 years after the Second Jewish War. I mean, if as a circumcised person you were not allowed to live in Jerusalem and nor even to walk through Jerusalem, then you had a difficult time in relating to the people who had their say in Jerusalem. So I think there are many reasons, I think, why one could probably trust these informations. The other question which I still have and the doubts which I have are shared by a lot of other people. I mean, whether we can rely on the Josephus material is highly doubtful. Because we know already, I mean, we can see it from the Testamentum Flavianum, we know already that Origen reads these texts differently from how Eusebius reads these texts. And we can see, unsurprisingly, that Eusebius reads them in a more Christianized version, the way we have it, than Origen. When Origen says that Josephus doesn't believe in Christ the Messiah, Eusebius says the opposite. And so we can unsurprisingly see a certain Christianizing of these texts. And we can see that even in the Ignatian letters. I mean, the further we go in history, the more Christianized become these texts and the more biblicized become these texts. So a harmonization takes place between what we've got in the canonical writings and in the so-called external witnesses. Now, both Pliny's letter exchange, just like Josephus, only survives through Christian hands. And when we compare the letter of Pliny to Trajan, it's such an outlier in so many ways compared to all the other, I mean, tens of letters that he has written to Trajan and got responses to it, right? So to what extent, I think we haven't started yet to dissecting the Pliny letter. And I think we should do it in exactly the same way as we work with Paul and now with Marcion's text. We should have a data analysis. And we should see what, if we compare this text, this Pliny letter, which is pretty long, if we compare this text data by data with the big corpus of letters that are extant of Pliny to Trajan, then we might come to a better conclusion and a better understanding of how these texts may have worked. But I'm always starting from a skeptical note, unless our data confirm our position. If this is a coherent text which fits into the lexicography and the semantics and many other things, word lengths, sentence lengths, and God knows what, then happy we are. And we have a more stable basis on which we can make any judgment. But until those times, I think it's so interesting, since we work with computer science and data, right? A lot of our assumptions are falling, and we have to reconfigure. And I think it's such exciting time that we are in a time where we have different tools, not just hammer and mortar.
And if I may, I mean, we'll finish with this. I think there's a good analogy here to be drawn between the old Platonic and Aristotelian belief of geocentric universe with the sun revolving around the earth, and now with new models, dare I say that, Mark and Newmarcus are becoming the Copernicus. Yeah, I mean, introducing new methodology to show that actually maybe the Earth is not the center of the universe, and that indeed the sun might be more important in terms of orbit in our small solar system. And the revolutionary scientific methods that are being applied, I think, can be daunting to those scholars in our field. And indeed, they're daunting to me. I mean, I make no bones about that. I find all of this really scary, this coding and big numbers and processes like this. But ultimately, if we're to move forward and have a genuine discussion about the conclusions that's being drawn from this data, then as a community we must begin to engage with it more effectively, and rather than just trying to pass it off.
Yeah.
And on that bombshell, Thank you so much yet again for joining us on the Patriska YouTube channel. As always, our links to Patreons and Twitters are linked down in the description. And hopefully in your feeds next week, we may, fingers crossed, but no promises at this point, have some person-to-person live Patristica conversations with scholars from the Studio Patriska conference that's being held in Oxford next week, where Marcus and I will be together, missing Mark, but having a beer for him. In the meantime, we'll see you next week, and thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.